In life, there are things that are very obvious but difficult to recognize within ourselves. One of them is arrogance. Many people think arrogance is just overt pride, a desire to win, or contempt for others. But in Eastern culture, arrogance is seen more deeply as a very subtle inner state, which can be hidden behind knowledge, success, morality, age, and even kindness. Ancient people always considered arrogance one of the biggest obstacles on the path to self-cultivation and personal growth. In today's video, we will explore why arrogance is so dangerous, how it manifests subtly in life, and how to recognize and transform it before becoming a victim of an inflated ego. If you enjoy insightful content that helps you understand people, life, and yourself better, please subscribe to the Simple Philosophy channel to follow our meaningful lessons. In everyday life, people often think of arrogance as someone who speaks loudly, boasts, or openly looks down on others. However, if we look deeper into the Eastern perspective, arrogance is not just an outward manifestation. It is a very subtle state of mind, difficult to recognize, and sometimes even more dangerous than obvious mistakes. Because there are people who are not loud or ostentatious, but deep down, they cling to the feeling that they understand things better, are righter, superior, or more special than others. And that is precisely the root of arrogance. Interpreting arrogance from an Eastern perspective is touching upon a very deep level of self-cultivation. In Eastern culture, especially in philosophies such as Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, people are judged not only by their outward behavior, but also by their inner state of mind. A person may behave quite appropriately and speak moderately, but if they are always clinging to their ego, always wanting to be better, right, recognized, and superior to others, then that arrogance is still subtly at work. In Eastern culture, arrogance is not just an attitude of considering oneself superior to others, but also an attachment to the ego. Clinging to the feeling that one is right, skilled, special, or better than others, this is a very profound definition, as it shows that arrogance is not simply a way of behaving, but an inner attachment. It lies not only in words, but in the way one views life, people, and oneself. Arrogant people often don't just want to live well. They also want to be more prominent, more right, more knowledgeable, or more respectable. They don't just want to have value, but they want that value to be perceived in a way that makes them feel superior. Therefore, arrogance easily creeps into even seemingly good things. A highly educated person might be arrogant because of their knowledge. A morally upright person might be arrogant because of their morality. A spiritual practitioner might be arrogant because they think they are more enlightened than others. Even a seemingly humble person might be arrogant because they secretly believe they are more profound than the crowd. This is what makes arrogance one of the most difficult things to identify, because it doesn't always have a harsh face. Often it appears in a very beautiful, very reasonable, and easily justified form. From an Eastern perspective, the root of arrogance lies in ego attachment. This means clinging tightly to a particular image of oneself and constantly wanting to protect that image. When a person overly identifies themselves with certain knowledge, achievements, position, experience, virtues, or personal identity, they are very likely to fall into a state of arrogance. Because when they cling too strongly to their ego, they find it difficult to accept their mistakes, are uncomfortable with constructive criticism, easily hurt by a lack of recognition, and find it very difficult to truly open themselves to new things. Why did the ancients consider arrogance so dangerous? Because arrogance not only tarnishes how people treat others, but also blocks the path to their own development. The ancients didn't fear someone who wasn't skilled. They feared someone who thought they were already skilled enough. They didn't fear someone who didn't understand. They feared someone who no longer felt the need to learn more. Arrogance impairs a person's ability to learn. This is the first and most dangerous consequence. When a person becomes overly confident in their own understanding, they stop truly listening. Outwardly, they may be sitting there listening, but inwardly, they are waiting for counterarguments, proof, or the conclusion that the other person is inferior. Such a person finds it difficult to grow up, because true maturity requires maintaining a certain emptiness to receive. One must always be able to think that perhaps they haven't seen everything. Perhaps they are lacking something. Perhaps someone else knows something they don't. But arrogance dries up that emptiness. It fills the person so completely that there is no room for anything new to enter. Arrogance also makes it difficult for people to listen. It's not just about not listening to feedback, but also about not being able to hear the depth of others' thoughts. Arrogant people often listen with their ego rather than with an open mind. They tend to look down on others, judge too quickly, assume they understand everything without truly grasping the essence of the matter. Because they don't truly listen, they easily miss important warnings, necessary additional perspectives, and invaluable lessons that life sends through others. Some people fall not because they lack intelligence, but because they are too certain they can't be wrong. Arrogance also makes people prone to looking down on others. This is very common in life. As the ego grows, respect for others tends to diminish. Arrogant people easily look down on those who are less educated, slower, not on the same level of understanding, not of the same achievements, or not share the same viewpoints. They may not say it out loud, but their attitude is revealed in their way of looking, listening, and reacting. Sadly, it is precisely when we look down on others that we are closing ourselves off from many valuable lessons. Life doesn't only teach us through those more accomplished than ourselves. Often, lessons come from ordinary people, those with less education, those from different backgrounds, or even from people we once thought weren't worth learning from. Those who maintain humility will find something to ponder everywhere. Arrogant people only see themselves. Even more dangerously, arrogance makes people unknowingly fall into mistakes. Because arrogant people often don't see the problem lies within themselves, it becomes harder to correct their mistakes and easier to repeat old ones. This is where arrogance becomes a very painful but insidious cycle. An ordinary person, upon experiencing failure, might reflect and ask themselves what needs to be improved. But arrogant people tend to explain failure in a way that protects their ego. They blame others for not understanding them, the environment for not being good enough, time not being right, or not meeting the right people. They might be partly right, but if in every event they always find external reasons without ever addressing the underlying flaws, they will forever repeat the same mistakes without learning anything. The ancients understood this very well, which is why they always considered arrogance to be the root of decline. A tree falls not because it is tall, but because it thinks it cannot fall. A person falls not just because they have made mistakes in the past, but because they no longer see themselves as capable of making mistakes. When a person loses the ability to self-reflect, that is when they are most dangerous. In the Eastern spirit, arrogance is dangerous because it disrupts inner harmony. Arrogant people may appear strong, but in reality, they are often very insecure. This is because they constantly have to protect their image, always have to be right, always have to prove their worth, and always feel uncomfortable when someone surpasses them, contradicts them, or doesn't acknowledge their worth. Such an inner self cannot truly be at peace. The more people cling to their ego, the more easily they live in invisible tension. They may not realize it, but every time their pride is hurt, every time they are not recognized as they wish, every time someone more capable appears, turmoil erupts within them. And it is these silent waves that gradually wear them down, harden them, and distance them from clear thinking. Conversely, those who learn to let go of arrogance will live much more lightly. They don't need to always be right. They don't need to always stand out. They don't need to always be considered the most understanding. They maintain a gentle heart and therefore retain their ability to learn, to correct mistakes, and to live harmoniously with others. That is why in the East, humility is not just a beautiful virtue, but a form of wisdom. It's not about lowering oneself, but about knowing that the world is vast beyond one's own understanding. Truly profound people often realize they still have much to learn the more they go. Arrogant people, on the other hand, think they have already reached their destination the further they go. If we were to summarize the core meaning of this lesson, it would probably be this. Arrogance is not just a flaw in attitude, but a disease of the ego. It not only makes people unapproachable, but also hinders their growth. And because it easily hides beneath beautiful facades, each person needs to examine themselves more carefully. Not to blame themselves, but to keep their hearts soft, open, and humble before life. Because, in the eyes of the ancients, a truly noble person is not someone who always stands above others. Rather, it is someone who, the more valuable they are, the more humble they become. The more knowledgeable they are, the more they listen. And the further they go, the less arrogant they become. And that is also the path for a person to not only become more successful, but also to become deeper, brighter, and more enduring in their journey as a human being. When it comes to arrogance, many people picture a very recognizable type of person. Someone with money who likes to look down on others. Someone in power who always wants to be obeyed. Someone who has achieved success and always wants to be praised. This image isn't wrong, but it only touches the surface. Looking deeper from an Eastern perspective, arrogance isn't a matter of status, but an inner matter. It doesn't depend on your position in society, but on how your inner self is functioning. Arrogance isn't exclusive to successful people. This is a crucial point if we want to understand the true nature of the issue. Many people think that only those with money, power, or achievements are prone to arrogance. In reality, poor people can be arrogant, uneducated people can be arrogant, and even those doing good deeds can be arrogant. The core of arrogance doesn't lie in circumstances, but in the ego within. A person without much money can still be arrogant by always thinking they are superior to the rich. A person without much knowledge can still be arrogant by despising those who are highly educated but live differently from them. A person living simply can also be arrogant because they feel they are more profound than those who chase after material possessions. A person doing good deeds can also be arrogant because they believe they are more moral than the majority. On the surface, these forms of arrogance don't seem as loud as typical boasting. But deep down, they all share a common root, the feeling of being superior to others in some way. And as that feeling grows, people gradually lose humility, lose the ability to listen, and begin to view life with judgment rather than understanding. This is why the ancients placed great importance on cultivating one's character rather than merely correcting one's behavior. Because if one only changes outwardly, they might become more polite. But that doesn't necessarily mean they'll become less arrogant. Some people speak very gently, but inwardly they are always comparing themselves to others. Some people don't show off openly, but they always see themselves as superior. Some people speak very little, but when others do speak, they quickly dismiss the words in their minds, feeling that they already know and understand better. Intellectual arrogance is one of the most common and subtle forms of pride. It is particularly dangerous because knowledge is something that is easily praised by society. When a person reads widely, understands deeply, speaks profoundly, and analyzes sharply, they easily gain recognition from others. And if they are not vigilant enough, that recognition will subtly transform into a breeding ground for ego. This is a very common but subtle phenomenon. A well-read, broad-minded, and knowledgeable person may gradually develop a feeling of understanding superior to others and disregard differing opinions. Initially, this feeling might be very subtle. It's just a slight annoyance when someone says something they consider superficial. Little impatience when others express themselves more slowly or understand more slowly. A slight internal reaction when encountering a perspective different from their own. But if not reflected upon, these small things will gradually become an internal habit. And from there, knowledge is no longer just a tool to expand the mind, but begins to become a platform on which the ego stands. Intellectually arrogant people often share a very distinctive characteristic. They are not easily receptive to new information if it comes from someone they don't respect. They listen not to understand, but to assess whether the other person is qualified enough to be listened to. They are not truly open to different perspectives, because deep down, they are accustomed to considering their own knowledge as the standard. This causes them to gradually lose one of the most precious qualities of true intelligence: flexibility and openness. A truly intelligent person is not someone who knows the most, but someone who, the more they know, the more they realize how little they still know. The deeper they learn, the broader the world becomes. The further they travel, the less hasty they are in judging. The more they understand, the less they crave proof. But if knowledge only makes a person more competitive, more eager to win, more righteous, and more inclined to be seen as profound, then what is growing within them may no longer be intelligence, but an ego cloaked in knowledge. Knowledge should ideally foster humility, but if not handled carefully, it can also fuel ego. This is a very real paradox. The more one reads, the more material one has to see what others lack. The more one understands, the more evidence one has to prove one's own correctness. The better one is at expressing oneself, the easier it is to win arguments. And without self-cultivation, all of this can easily lead a person to mistakenly believe they are in a superior position to everyone else. From there, intellectual arrogance can manifest in many very common ways. It's easily interrupting others because you think they're saying something too basic. It's the habit of using your knowledge to make others feel inferior. It's preferring to correct others rather than help them understand. It's the discomfort of having to learn from someone with less education or knowledge than yourself. It's turning conversations into a show-off rather than a place to connect. The most dangerous thing is that people with this kind of arrogance often don't realize they're being arrogant. They easily believe they're just being frank, just debating, just maintaining high standards, or just speaking the truth. And it's true that sometimes what they say isn't wrong. But the problem isn't just about whether the content is right or wrong, but about the mindset behind that content. A truthful statement from a large ego can still lead a person astray from maturity. The ancients understood this very well, which is why they considered true learning not just about accumulating knowledge, but also about reducing self-centeredness. Learning that makes one more flexible with each lesson is correct learning. Learning that makes one more contemptuous of others is misguided learning. Reading with an open mind is a blessing. Reading that inflates the ego is not necessarily progress. If there's one practical lesson to be learned from this, it's that the more knowledgeable a person becomes, the more they need to learn to reflect on themselves. Whenever you feel uncomfortable with someone else's opinion, ask yourself if you're defending the truth or just your ego. Whenever you feel the urge to quickly argue back, ask yourself if you're seeking to understand more or just to win. Whenever you hear someone else speak superficially, ask yourself if you can help them understand better, instead of just seeing yourself as superior. Ultimately, what makes a person profound is not just how much they know, but whether that knowledge broadens or narrows their mind. If understanding makes us more humble, more attentive, and less judgmental, that is knowledge nurturing us. But if understanding only makes us more aloof, more rigid, and more prone to belittling others, then it is very likely that what is growing is not wisdom, but a very subtle and frightening form of arrogance. There's a very loud kind of arrogance, obvious to everyone. It's boasting, looking down on others, a desire to impose one's will, and a constant urge to stand out. But there's another kind of arrogance, far more dangerous because it's cloaked in a beautiful facade. It doesn't come from money, power, or fame, but from what seems to be the best qualities in a person: morality, a righteous way of life, self-cultivation, and principles that one is very proud of. And precisely because it appears right, it's even harder to recognize. Arrogance in morality and spiritual practice is one of the most subtle forms of arrogance. It's a very difficult form of arrogance to recognize. Some people live virtuous lives, practice vegetarianism, do good deeds, practice spiritual discipline, or strictly adhere to their principles. Yet they develop a disdain for those who haven't achieved the same. When goodness becomes a reason to elevate oneself and belittle others, it is no longer complete virtue. This is a very profound aspect of Eastern philosophy. The East doesn't just look at what a person is doing, but also at the mindset behind it. An action that looks similar but stems from two different inner feelings will have vastly different values. It's living simply. One person does it to lighten their heart, while another does it to feel superior to those chasing material possessions. Upholding principles, one person does it to avoid deviating from what is right, while another does it to feel more worthy than others. Doing good, one person does it out of compassion, while another does it to feel like a good person. They may look very similar on the outside, but what's inside is what matters most. And it is in that inner self that arrogance easily creeps in. People who fall into this type of arrogance often don't think of themselves as arrogant. They even believe they are living righteously. They don't drink alcohol, don't swear, don't live dissolutely, and don't do anything obviously wrong. They are disciplined, principled, and live a more moral life than many others. And because of these genuinely good qualities, they begin to develop a subtle feeling that they are in a superior position. From then on, they view others with judgment rather than understanding. Seeing someone who lives differently from themselves, they quickly conclude that they are shallow, inferior, or lacking in cultivation. Seeing someone making mistakes instead of compassion, they easily become critical. Seeing someone who doesn't understand what they understand, they lose patience, only feeling that the other person is inferior. The danger lies in the fact that when someone is morally arrogant, their ego is often very strong. They always have evidence to convince themselves they are right. When people have so many reasons to believe they are on the side of good, it becomes even harder for them to see the darkness within themselves. When goodness becomes a reason to elevate oneself and put others down, that goodness has begun to deviate. It no longer retains its original purity. For true virtue does not make people feel superior, but rather makes them softer, deeper, and more compassionate. Those who truly practice virtue tend to be less judgmental. Those with true morality tend to be less arrogant. Those with true understanding tend to be less inclined to prove themselves right. If the better one lives, the more resentful one becomes of those who are not so good. The more one practices spiritual discipline, the more contemptuous one becomes of those who are not. The more one adheres to principles, the more one feels superior to others. Then it is very likely that what is being nurtured is no longer morality, but rather an ego disguised as morality. The story of someone who always thinks they're right is a very common example of this type of arrogance. There are people in their families or workplaces who believe that because they have experience and know everything, their opinions are the most correct. They rarely listen attentively and often dismiss other people's perspectives. Over time, they not only tire out those around them, but also limit their own personal growth. This type of person is very common in life. It could be parents, older people, superiors, more experienced individuals, or simply people who have gone through more hardships than others. They aren't necessarily bad people. In fact, many of them have worked hard, lived responsibly, and endured many things to gain the life experience they have today. The issue isn't that they have experience, but that they've begun to equate that experience with truth. When someone believes that their experience automatically makes them right, they gradually lose the ability to engage in dialogue. They listen to others but are already mentally prepared. They are no longer genuinely curious about new perspectives because they believe they already understand life well enough. They rarely ask questions, instead often jumping to conclusions. They rarely truly listen, instead waiting to correct, deny, or impose their views. Within a family, this type of person can easily make children or relatives feel suffocated. It's not because they're always malicious, but because they don't give others space to be different from them. Every suggestion is met with opposition. Every new perspective is seen as immature. Every difference is interpreted as a mistake that needs correcting. Gradually, those around them no longer want to share, not because they lack affection, but because they know they won't be truly listened to. The same applies to work. There are people who are very talented and experienced, but the longer you work with them, the harder it becomes. It's not because they lack ability, but because they are too certain they are right. They rarely learn from younger people. They rarely acknowledge new ways of doing things. They rarely admit that the world has changed and that things no longer work the way they used to. They cling to their old beliefs as if they were immutable truths, and that's what slows them down while they think they're firmly established. Over time, they not only exhaust those around them, but also limit their own growth. This is the greatest price of arrogance. Not only damages relationships, but also prevents a person from developing from within. Because when a person believes they are right for too long, they no longer have the flexibility to learn. It's thought-provoking that many people aren't bad at all, but are unknowingly trapped in this kind of arrogance. They think they're living by principles, but in reality, they're being rigid. They think they're upholding what's right, but in reality, they're clinging to their ego. They think they're helping others improve, but in reality, they're making others feel controlled and insignificant. If we want to reflect on ourselves, perhaps each of us should ask a few very honest questions. When we see someone living differently from us, do we feel curiosity or disdain? When we hear someone say something contrary to our opinion, do we truly want to understand or just want to refute it? When we do good deeds, do we feel our hearts broaden or do we only feel more valuable? When we offer advice to others, are we acting out of compassion or from a sense of superiority? Ultimately, true morality doesn't elevate a person in their own eyes. It makes them quieter, gentler, and more humble. True self-cultivation doesn't make one feel superior to others, but reduces the need to be better than anyone else. And true maturity isn't about being more right than others, but about having enough depth to uphold what is right, while maintaining humility in one's heart. There's something very interesting about life. When people have little experience, they often want to prove themselves. They want to be recognized. They want others to see that they understand. that they are skilled, that they are valuable. But the further they go, the deeper their experiences, the more they reach true levels of understanding, the more they tend to become quieter. Not because they become weaker, but because they begin to understand that the world is much larger than their ego. And the more they understand that, the less they need to stand above others to feel valuable. The story of the most talented yet humble person is a beautiful example of this. In contrast to those who tend to show off the more they know, there are those who speak less the more they understand, and who respect others the more they achieve. They understand that the more they know, the more they see the world as vast and their own insignificance as small. This is a sign of true wisdom, not a display of knowledge. You can encounter this type of person in many different environments. Some are highly skilled professionals, but speak very softly. Some achieve great things, but remain humble and attentive. Some are deeply knowledgeable, well-read, and possess broad understanding. But the more you interact with them, the more you realize they have no need to dominate anyone. They don't use their knowledge to make others feel inferior. They don't use their achievements to create distance. They don't use their experience to silence dissenting viewpoints. What sets them apart is not just their intelligence, but the fact that their intelligence doesn't breed an ego. They understand that knowledge isn't a reason to be superior to others, but rather an opportunity to see life more broadly and people more deeply. The more they know, the more they realize how little they still know. The further they go, the more they see how much they have to learn. And it is this realization that prevents them from being overly concerned with being better than anyone else in every conversation, every debate, or every relationship. The more truly intelligent a person is, the more icily they respect others. This isn't because they are weak or lack conviction, but because they understand that each person has a unique life, perspective, and experience that they themselves may not have encountered. They know that some lessons aren't found in books, degrees, or achievements, but in each person's own unique encounters. Therefore, they don't rush to judgment, don't easily look down on others, and don't like to jump to conclusions. This is one of the most beautiful signs of inner depth. The greater a person is, the less they need to show off. The more stable they are, the less they need to make noise. The more valuable they are, the less they need to constantly prove their worth, because true things don't need to be loud. Conversely, arrogance pushes people in a completely different direction. On the surface, arrogant people may stand out. They may speak well, argue sharply, appear knowledgeable, and make a strong impression during initial interactions. But over time, arrogance rarely helps a person maintain lasting relationships, because what keeps people together is not just admiration, but also a feeling of being respected and at ease in each other's presence. Why does arrogance lead to loneliness? Arrogant people may attract attention temporarily, but it's difficult to maintain long-term loyalty.
No one truly feels comfortable around someone who always wants to be better than them, always wants to prove themselves, and always secretly considers themselves superior to others. Arrogance alienates people, sometimes without them even realizing it.
This is a very quiet kind of loneliness. Arrogant people aren't always openly opposed by others. Often they have people around them, people greet them, and relationships that seem quite stable on the surface. But if you look closely, they'll realize they're not truly close to anyone. Others may respect them to some extent, but are unwilling to open up deeply to them. They may admire them, but don't feel comfortable being around them for long. They may acknowledge their abilities, but don't truly want a long-term partnership. Because no one feels comfortable constantly being around someone who tends to make them feel inferior. A person who always wants to prove themselves will tire others out. A person who always wants to be better will create an unequal relationship. A person who implicitly believes they understand things better, deeply, and more accurately will cause the other person to gradually withdraw. Not because they are weak, but because no one wants to remain in a space where they are not fully respected. Arrogance also makes it difficult for people to have genuine relationships. To connect deeply with someone, one needs gentleness, openness, and the ability to see each other as equals in dignity. But when the ego is too big, relationships easily become a place of comparison, self-display, or subtle stratification. And then, true intimacy becomes very difficult to achieve. Sadly, arrogant people often don't understand why they're becoming increasingly isolated. They might think they simply don't fit in with the crowd, that they're too different, and therefore few understand them, or that others are jealous, superficial, or lack the depth to be with them. In some cases, this might be partly true. But if someone consistently finds themselves difficult to approach, struggling to maintain long-term relationships, and unable to make others feel comfortable, the problem likely lies not only in the world around them, but also in the energy they bring to their relationships. Arrogance distances people from others, sometimes without them even realizing it. This is something worth pondering. This distance doesn't happen dramatically. It occurs when others hesitate to share their true feelings. When they no longer want to offer advice because they know they won't be heard. When they choose to keep their distance because they feel judged. When they are still there, but no longer truly want to get closer. And so, arrogant people can gradually fall into a very strange kind of solitude. The more they want to stand out, the fewer people want to be near them. The more they want to be superior, the fewer people want to walk alongside them. The more they try to maintain a strong and righteous image, the harder it is to have connections that are soft and genuine enough to nourish their souls. Perhaps the most profound lesson here is this: true wisdom doesn't distance people from others, but rather draws them closer through respect. True achievement doesn't make people unattainable, but teaches them to humble themselves at the right time. The deeper one's understanding, the less judgmental one becomes. The further one travels, the less one needs to stand tall, and the more mature one becomes. The more one understands that the most valuable thing isn't to command respect, but to make others feel safe and respected in your presence. Ultimately, what truly makes a person great is not how high they stand, but how far they can go while maintaining humility, respect, and the ability to be close to others without making anyone feel insignificant. There's a very real paradox in life. Many people think that what hinders their progress is a lack of opportunity, resources, luck, or talent. But in reality, there's something even more dangerous than all of that. It's when people lose the ability to recognize their own shortcomings. As long as they know they're not enough, there's still room for growth. But once ego blinds their vision, people can remain stagnant for a long time while still believing they are progressing. Arrogance is a major obstacle on the path to maturity. This is not just a moral observation, but a very real truth. To grow, people must learn to accept feedback, acknowledge their shortcomings and mistakes. But arrogance makes us defensive against all feedback in view. Admitting mistakes is a loss of value. This is what causes many people to stop very early in their development journey. Looking deeper, maturity isn't about accumulating more knowledge, achievements, or skills. All of those are important, but not enough. True maturity is the ability to continuously adjust oneself to reality. It means knowing when you're wrong, knowing when you need improvement, and learning when you're not good enough. When receiving feedback, not reacting impulsively with pride, but remaining calm enough to consider what aspects need self-reflection. This is very difficult. And it is precisely because it is difficult that it distinguishes someone who is truly growing up from someone who is merely accumulating superficial qualities. A mature person is not someone who never makes mistakes. Rather, it is someone who doesn't consider their mistakes unacceptable. They understand that a person's value lies not in always being right, but in their ability to bravely confront their shortcomings. Conversely, arrogant people often find it very difficult to do so. For them, being pointed out for shortcomings is not just information to be accepted, but rather a threat to their self-image. They easily feel hurt, disrespected, or belittled. And so, instead of opening up to learn, they immediately become defensive. Some people defend themselves by arguing back. Some defend themselves by remaining silent but harboring resentment inside. Some defend themselves by finding reasons to justify their actions. Some don't react immediately but later remain unchanged because deep down they don't truly accept that they need to change. This is precisely why many people stop very early in their personal growth journey. They may continue to learn, work, and gain more experience, but their core essence no longer moves much. They only accept what doesn't hurt their ego, while things that could truly help them grow are blocked right at the door. Arrogance not only slows down progress, but it also isolates people from life's most valuable lessons. For most of the deepest growth doesn't come when things are easy, but from feedback, challenges, exposure of blind spots, and being shown where one is still immature. If each time we only retreat, resist, or deny, then no matter how many times life teaches us, we will never truly learn. The subtle signs of arrogance in life are often quiet, making them all the more worth examining. These could include a preference for always being right, discomfort when others are better than oneself, an unwillingness to admit mistakes, judging others too quickly, a penchant for lecturing others without self-reflection, or a constant feeling of understanding things better than the majority. These signs are sometimes small, but if they persist, they will gradually inflate one's ego. The desire to be right is a very common trait. There are people who, in every conversation, want to be the one to conclude that they are correct. They aren't necessarily bad people, but there's always an underlying need to maintain the position of the one who understands better. They find it difficult to let go of an argument, even if the matter is no longer important. It's not because they love the truth so much, but often simply because they can't stand the feeling of losing the argument. Feeling resentful when others are better than oneself is also a very subtle sign. Outwardly, one might still smile, offer congratulations, and speak kindly. But inwardly there's a slight unease, a feeling of withdrawal, a discomfort at seeing someone more prominent, more recognized, or more successful than oneself. If this feeling isn't confronted directly, it can easily turn into comparison, judgment, or subtly belittling the other person to satisfy one's own ego. Refusing to admit fault is a very clear manifestation of arrogance, although it can appear in many softer forms. Some people don't admit their mistakes directly. They only offer lengthy explanations to ultimately maintain their image as the right person. Some people admit their mistakes verbally but don't truly accept them. Some even know they are wrong but refuse to speak up, because for them, admitting fault is like losing face. Judging others too quickly is also a very noticeable sign. Arrogant people often easily believe they can accurately judge people, understand issues quickly, and hastily conclude who is shallow, who is deep, who is skilled, and who is unskilled. But this haste reveals an ego that is under scrutiny, because when people are truly insightful, they are usually more cautious in drawing conclusions about others. They understand that human life is very complex, and that a few appearances are not enough to fully understand everything. A common form of arrogance among those with some knowledge or experience is the tendency to lecture others while rarely reflecting on oneself. They often say many things that are true for others. They can analyze things very well, offer insightful feedback, and quickly identify other people's problems. But when it comes to themselves, they rarely truly sit down to examine their own minds, reactions, and shortcomings in their lives. They are skilled at guiding others, but weak at self-correction. Constantly feeling like you understand things better than the majority is a very subtle sign. Some people live with the feeling that most people around them don't have the depth to understand what they do. In some cases, they may genuinely have different perspectives. But if that feeling becomes an internal habit, it can easily turn into a kind of elevated mindset that they themselves don't realize. And once they get used to seeing themselves from that position, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to truly learn from others. These signs are sometimes very small, but if they persist, they will cause the ego to grow. And the bigger the ego, the smaller the potential for true maturity. Because maturity requires flexibility. Flexibility to listen, flexibility to recognize, flexibility to correct, flexibility to not see one's shortcomings as a collapse of self-worth. If we had to take a practical lesson from this topic, it would probably be to learn to see each time we receive criticism, each time we feel annoyed, each time we feel hurt, each time we want to prove ourselves right, as a mirror. Not to blame ourselves or force ourselves to be perfect, but to recognize where our ego is operating. Simply seeing this gives us a chance to be less controlled by it. Ultimately, what keeps a person growing isn't how good they are, but how much humility they retain to continue learning. And sometimes, the greatest step towards maturity isn't learning something new, but daring to admit that there are things you still don't fully understand, haven't lived enough of, and haven't yet improved within yourself. Arrogance isn't something exclusive to a select few or the most successful. It's a very human, relatable, and sometimes subtle state of mind. It can manifest in a single word, a glance, an unpleasant reaction, a need to be right, or a hidden feeling that one understands things better, more deeply, or more accurately than others. Importantly, if left unrecognized and untransformed, Arrogance not only damages relationships, but also silently hinders one's own personal growth. Therefore, the method of identifying and transforming arrogance does not begin with correcting others, but with introspection. This is the most difficult step, but also the most genuine, because only when people dare to look at their own ego honestly can the process of change begin. The first step is to honestly reflect on yourself. Ask yourself, are you truly listening to others or just waiting for your turn to speak? Are you learning or just trying to prove yourself? Only when you dare to seriously examine your own ego do you have the opportunity to change. These are very simple questions, yet they have a profound impact if we truly stop to answer them. In a conversation, when someone shares something that contradicts our own thoughts, do we truly listen to understand, or are we silently preparing to counter them? When someone offers feedback, do we calmly accept it to see how true it is, or do we immediately try to defend ourselves? When we meet someone more knowledgeable, do we open ourselves up to learn, or do we feel a little hesitant, uncomfortable, or secretly want to belittle them to feel better? Many manifestations of arrogance don't lie in loud words, but in quick, internal reactions. Therefore, to transform it, one must begin by carefully observing their inner self. Not to condemn oneself, but to see the truth, because before seeing it, we will think we are just living normally. But when we begin to clearly see the small reactions of the ego, we understand why we sometimes get unnecessarily annoyed, easily offended, competitive, or find it difficult to truly learn from others. A very effective way to identify arrogance is to pay attention to situations that hurt your pride. Whenever you receive criticism, correction, counter-arguments are belittled, or someone surpasses you, observe how you react internally. If you immediately want to retaliate, prove yourself, regain your position, or deny the other person, it's very likely your ego has been hurt. And that's when you have the best chance to see arrogance clearly. Many people think that transforming arrogance means trying to appear humble, but false humility is just another subtle form of ego. Outwardly, one might speak softly, humble oneself verbally, but inwardly still feel superior. The root of the problem remains unchanged. True transformation isn't about projecting a likable image, but about gradually letting go of the inner need to stand tall. To achieve that, people need to learn to tolerate the feeling of not being good enough. This is a very important ability, because much arrogance stems from the fear of being underestimated or an inner feeling of not being truly secure. When a person is not comfortable with their true worth, they easily have to build a higher image to protect themselves. But when they gradually accept that they are still lacking, still immature, and still make mistakes in many places without losing their value, people will soften up considerably. That's when humility begins to emerge naturally. Not humility out of moral obligation, but humility stemming from a genuine realization that one still has much to learn. Cultivating true humility begins with changing your perspective on others. Learn to see the good in others, even those less educated, younger, or different from you. Remember that everyone has something to teach you. When you understand that life is vaster than what you know, you will become less complacent and more adaptable. This is a very profound, yet very ordinary practice. There are lessons that don't come from celebrities, successful people, or those with high academic degrees. Sometimes an ordinary worker can teach us about perseverance. An elderly person with little education can teach us about living with compassion and kindness. A child can teach us about innocence. Someone who has experienced suffering can teach us about resilience. Someone who lives life at a slower pace can teach us about serenity. If we truly open our hearts, we will find that life is full of people who can become our teachers in some way. Conversely, if we always approach things from a top-down perspective, we will miss many learning opportunities. Because once we believe we understand more than the majority, it becomes difficult to hear valuable insights coming from unexpected sources. Another very practical way to cultivate humility is to practice doing good deeds without seeking recognition. Practice silence after doing something valuable. Practice not rushing to tell, not rushing to show off, not rushing to seek others' approval. This is a very powerful exercise for the ego, because the ego always wants to be seen, validated, and appreciated. As we gradually learn to do the right thing without seeking fame, our inner strength will grow significantly. Furthermore, Practice saying, "I don't know," much more often. It's a very simple yet liberating statement. Arrogant people often fear not knowing because they see it as diminishing them. But mature people understand that admitting ignorance is the gateway to true knowledge. No one can learn deeply if they always have to maintain the image of knowing everything. True humility doesn't diminish a person. On the contrary, it makes them deeper, easier to learn, easier to live with, and more trustworthy. A humble person isn't someone who denies their own worth, but rather someone who knows what they have but doesn't need to use it to elevate themselves or put others down. Ultimately, transforming arrogance is not a one-time event. It's a very long process of self-cultivation because the ego can constantly change form. Today, it appears in knowledge, tomorrow in morality, another day in hurt, in success, or even in the very thought that one is more humble than others. Therefore, perhaps the most important thing is not to try to become completely free of arrogance, but to maintain the ability for continuous self-reflection. As long as we still know how to look back at ourselves, dare to recognize the places where our ego is interfering, and maintain a spirit of learning from life and from people, then we are still on the right track. And sometimes, the most beautiful sign of a truly mature person is not how many profound things they can say, but rather that the more they live, the less they need to stand tall, the more they understand, the more they learn to humble themselves, and the further they go, the more they maintain a gentle, clear, and grateful attitude towards this vast world. There are things in life that don't cause people to stumble immediately, but they subtly hold them back for a long time. Arrogance is one such thing. It doesn't always manifest as blatant pride, loud words, or overtly contemptuous attitudes. Often, it's very subtle, very sophisticated, very reasonable, even cloaked in the appearance of confidence, knowledge, or integrity. But if one doesn't recognize it, they can carry it with them for years, without understanding why they become increasingly difficult to learn, listen to, approach, and truly grow. The practical lesson for the audience lies here. If today you find yourself easily irritated by criticism, prone to looking down on others, or always feeling the need to prove yourself right, that could be a sign worth reevaluating. Arrogance doesn't make people stronger. It only makes it harder for them to grow. This is a very practical lesson because it doesn't lie in abstract philosophies, but in the everyday reactions of each person. Sometimes it's just a single instance of someone offering feedback that immediately makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes it's just hearing someone say something different from our own that makes us want to contradict them right away. Sometimes it's just meeting someone who is inferior to us in some way, and a feeling of judgment naturally arises in our minds. Sometimes we don't say it out loud, but deep down, there's always a silent need to be recognized, to be seen as right, to be understood better, to have a deeper understanding. These reactions may seem minor at first glance, but upon closer examination, they reveal the voice of the ego. And if this ego remains unrecognized, it will grow larger and larger in the most ordinary situations. Gradually, people will live within a shell they no longer recognize. A shell that makes it difficult to accept new things, uncomfortable to be touched, hard to truly respect those who are different from themselves, and hard to open their hearts to learn from life. It's worth considering that many people think arrogance makes them stronger. They believe that arrogance gives them a feeling of being more secure, superior, and right. But this is only a temporary feeling of ego. In the long run, arrogance doesn't make people stronger. It only makes them more rigid. And a person who is too rigid will find it difficult to grow. Because true maturity always requires a certain degree of flexibility. Flexibility to listen to what you don't like. Flexibility to admit that you might be wrong. Flexibility to accept that others also have things worth learning. Flexibility to not see your own shortcomings as a threat to your self-worth. This flexibility is the foundation of sustainable development. The ego, on the other hand, always wants to be rigid, to maintain its position, to remain unaffected. And because of this, it keeps people stuck in an old image for a very long time. If you find yourself easily irritated by feedback today, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a very valuable sign. Because only through reaction can we discover areas within ourselves that need self-reflection. That feeling of irritation isn't always due to someone else's mistake. Often, it's a sign that our ego is being hurt. And if instead of immediately reacting, we pause to ask why this bothers us so much, we begin to connect with a deeper part of ourselves. Similarly, if you find yourself easily looking down on others, be very careful. Looking down on others is one of the clearest signs of arrogance, even though it may manifest subtly. Sometimes it's simply thinking that someone is shallow, that person is incompetent, or someone else isn't mature enough to understand you. But this very perspective is inadvertently closing many doors to learning. Because when one is in a higher position in their mind, it becomes very difficult to truly see the value in others. And if you always feel the need to prove yourself right, that's a very valuable mirror to look into. Not because being right isn't important, but because in many situations, what we're trying to uphold isn't necessarily the truth, but rather our image in the eyes of others. The constant need to be right often doesn't stem from intelligence, but from an ego that needs protection. Perhaps the biggest practical lesson is this: every time you feel upset, every time you feel hurt, every time you want to win, every time you want to prove yourself, instead of just looking outward, try looking inward. Ask yourself if you are defending the truth or defending an image. Ask yourself if you truly want to understand more or just want to win more. Simply being honest with those questions will begin to enter a different level of maturity. Summarizing the profound meaning of this theme within the Eastern spirit is all the more thought-provoking. In Eastern culture, self-cultivation is not only about doing what is right, but also about learning to humble oneself so that wisdom and virtue can flourish. Arrogance is a very subtle trap for humans. Recognizing it is not easy, but once recognized and knowing how to humble oneself at the right time, a person will enter a very different level of maturity. This is very profound, because many people still think that self-cultivation is about trying to live right, speak well, and do good. But in the depths of Eastern philosophy, self-cultivation is also a very inner journey. It is a journey of learning to observe one's own mind, learning to see when the ego is interfering, learning not to let understanding turn into competition, not to let good deeds turn into arrogance, not to let achievements become a distance from others. Minimizing the ego doesn't mean denying one's own worth. It's not self-deprecation, it's not lowering oneself, and it's not living a dull life. Minimizing the ego means reducing the constant desire to be superior to others, so that when wisdom comes, it isn't used as a tool for proving oneself. So that when virtue comes, it isn't used as a reason for contempt. So that when success comes, it doesn't make one forget that they are still just a human being learning to live in this vast world. Arrogance is a very subtle trap for humans because it can hide under many beautiful forms. Sometimes it hides under knowledge. Sometimes it hides under morality. Sometimes it hides under hurt. Sometimes it hides under the very feeling that one has understood life deeply enough. And precisely because it is so subtle, people need to be even more vigilant in self-reflection. But thankfully, once people realize this, they begin to have freedom. Freedom to no longer have to maintain an image. Freedom to continue learning. Freedom to be softer, brighter, and more authentic. And that is a very different level of maturity. A level where people are no longer so concerned with being better than others, but begin to care more about who they are becoming. Perhaps that is the most valuable thing. It's not about living in a way that makes others see you as mature, but about living in a way that truly broadens, deepens, and makes you more humble with each passing year. Because ultimately, a truly mature person isn't someone who is always right, but someone who, the more they live, the more they learn to humble themselves, the more they understand, the less arrogant they become, and the further they go, the more they maintain a grateful learning and mindful attitude towards their own ego.